scoffed at you Southerners for thinking that 45 degrees was cold. Well, let me offer this morning that I am thoroughly converted, and I in every form, sure. But I'm glad you braved the cold weather and joined us this morning. Paul gave a beautiful recap of where this course has been, so I will leave that aside. Other than just to say that if you have been with us in previous weeks, we're going to continue conversations that have already started. But if you are new with us this morning and have not been part of the previous weeks or missed one, don't worry. You're in the right place, and you're going to be able to jump right into the conversation. Each week is really meant to stand on its own, knowing that our schedules are complex and varied. I think if I weren't teaching this course, I wouldn't be able to make it for all of our sessions together. So I get it. Looks like my computer fell asleep. Hopefully you will not follow suit in the time. Paul gave this beautiful recap, and sort of the highlight of where our conversations have been has been the surprise recognition, not only that so much of the Bible is actually about economics and poverty and food scarcity and homelessness, so that's one surprise. But the second surprise is that when the Bible talks about economics and poverty, it's less concerned with crisis scenarios. A hurricane hits, a tornado happens, something surprising and natural happens to disrupt someone's access to the basic needs of life. But the Bible is more concerned with systemic conditions, sort of the structures and systems that lead to the condition of poverty in the first place. It's giving way more emphasis on that. And as a result, when the Bible talks about solutions to poverty, and it has a lot to say about that, its concerns are less with individual acts of charity. Here's how Julie is going to be really kind to her neighbor in need. And it's more about how do we create neighborhoods that can flourish? How do we create opportunities that ward off the possibility of poverty in the first place? And we talked about that, but I wanted to give you one image that I think I hadn't given you before to try to pull it all together. You might think of the Bible's response to economic injustice as two steps or two footprints. The one footprint is the foot of charity. This is the constant invitation for us to be generous and compassionate to our neighbor in need. The second footstep, or the second foot, is that of justice. How do we become engaged in work that creates possibilities for flourishing for everyone? And in the Old Testament, these two steps go together. In our own lives and ministries, these two steps go together. It's not either or. It's always both and. It's always compassion to the neighbor, and it's always working towards creating better neighborhoods. Both of them are always paired. Which, though, does the church tend to lean into more? Charity. And why is that? Why do you think that is? Sorry, I circled the one that I think we need to move towards, but it's the other one that I think we lean into more. Why do you think that is? I think we've asked this question in various forms before, but why is it that we end up here in the life of the church more than here?
It's easier.
It's easier, okay. It's all hard, but it's relatively easier. It's less controversial, might feel less political, right? Please?
I agree with the less political, and also the church in and of itself hasn't had political power in hundreds of years. It used to be more the foot of justice, but now that it's not the seat of power, it has shifted to charity.
Yeah. That could be a part of it too, although that's a really complex thing because certain parts of the church, I would argue, are very much in power. That's not a no to your point. It's just that it's complicated, very much. Why else? Yeah.
It's episodic.
It's episodic.
All responses to charity are everybody now
Yes.
do this.
Yes.
Done.
It's a program for Sunday, March 7th.
Right.
Right?
We can all do that.
Yes, we can all do
It's
that.
not that big of a commitment because it's just one Sunday.
That's right.
Or
That's right.
3 weeks even.
Yeah.
We can do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, if you're really aggressive, 3
The
weeks.
justice stuff is usually a bigger commitment.
That's right. It's longer. It's slower. The progress is less clear. By the way, the thanks and recognition of the justice work is also less explicit, right? That's all goes into it. There was over here.
Well, I guess the difference is justice requires challenging the status quo. And so it requires challenging, it's more, more conflict.
Yeah, it could be more conflictual. Absolutely. Absolutely. Please, let's get one more. Charity doesn't trouble the powerful. Wow. What a poignant way to say that. And, I mean, if I can add like a footnote to that, I would say, yes, it doesn't challenge the powerful, but also I think we can be engaged in charity work and not ever come to question our own wealth, right? Like we can also, the charity work can sort of silo off the question about what we do with our own money, or how do we get here, what responsibilities do we have. Now, maybe not, but it's part of the same thing that you're naming that I think is really powerful. Let's get one more here.
Go ahead.
I would like to, just like a footnote to mine, justice, like some people can outright disagree with the kind of justice you're doing and believe it's morally reprehensible, but saying that you hate charity is almost universally looked down on.
Yeah.
Like someone doesn't like the charity or the people you're giving charity to, they're not going to be like, I hate charity.
Sure. Yeah, though that's a great point. Like there's something more socially acceptable about doing this. Now maybe that's tied up with it being apolitical and easier and all the other things that you've named. But yeah, there's definitely more controversy in this, right? So we've seen, or the longer version of the class, again, remember I asked Carmi to do the 92-week version of this class and she said that was a bit too long. We would get into all of this stuff in much more detail, but what we want to do this week and then into next week is we want to turn to the Gospels. So far we've been a lot in the Old Testament and there's a lot more the Old Testament has to say. But I want to show you just sort of like with our new perspective, I want to take a rapid look at Jesus' ministry. Remember how I assigned all of the Old Testament as homework for this week? Well, this assignment's relatively easy. You're just going to go home and read all of the Gospels before next Sunday. Now, that's a lot less than all of the Old Testament, right? So, but I want to sort of look again at Jesus' ministry. And actually, I think what we'll notice when we look again is that Jesus has way more to say about economics and poverty than he does about heaven and hell and the age of baptism and who can marry who and all of these other things combined. And I think what we'll also notice is that Jesus' interests include both of these, but I think his interests go towards this camp. I love that there's this layer of dust on the screen, so I've actually left a streak heading towards, I don't know if you can see it, to justice. All right, so that's where we're headed. I want to start with a quote that when I first read, it was just like one of these eye-opening moments for me in my own pursuit of understanding what Scripture has to say about poverty. It's from a scholar named Richard Horsley, and he says this: trying to understand Jesus' speech and action without knowing how Roman imperialism determined the conditions of life in Galilee and Jerusalem would be like trying to understand Martin Luther King Jr. without knowing how slavery, Reconstruction, and segregation determined the lives of African Americans in the U.S. And in fact, I think that's exactly how we approach the Gospels. We take the Gospels as these little morsels of truth, profound as they are, but abstracted from what was actually happening in the political and economic and social world of Jesus's time. So where I want to start is just to kind of give you some overview of like, here's what's happening in the Galilee, where Jesus did his ministry at that time, so to help frame a different way of thinking about Jesus' words. Make sense? Okay, so let's start with a map. This is ancient Palestine, which we now today called Israel. And I've highlighted in yellow and orange the two main places where Jesus, where we find Jesus in the Gospels. Of course, down here in Judea, this is the area of Jerusalem. Jesus spends very little time there. In fact, in the three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he only goes there in the final week of his life. John has him there a little bit more. But really, Jesus' life is spent up here in a region called the Galilee. Now, the Galilee it's sort of the richest agricultural part of the country. So you find a lot, the whole economy is still based on agriculture, but this is the best area to do agriculture. You've got the Sea of Galilee, which is right there in the center. A lot of Jesus' ministry engages in the Sea of Galilee. There's fishing there as well. So this is the primary context of Galilee. Yeah, let me get this question here.
Nope. I thought Nazareth was kind of looked down upon in the Bible as like,
Oh, man.
hold on, you're telling me the Messiah, the Savior of us all, is from the slums.
Yeah. So I love when you don't know that I do this, but I hand out $20 bills in advance of each class to have people say things that are on my next slide. And once again, this is exactly the point. Because the disciple Nathanael, at one point, when Jesus is first coming around, this is in the beginning of the Gospel of John, they hear that this guy who is doing these miracles and has these claims is from this town of Nazareth. And Nathanael, knowing that and knowing what Jesus is claiming, says, can anything good come of Nazareth? Right? He knows what Nazareth was in the ancient world. And we don't get this. Like the Old Testament or the New Testament doesn't pause and tell us this backstory. But let me tell you this backstory. The Galilee, do y'all remember watching Hunger Games? So I know it's been a minute. But there was a District 12, which was this district that they just extracted all of these resources from and was incredibly impoverished. That was the Galilee of Jesus' time. And the worst of the worst in Galilee, the most impoverished place, was Nazareth. Exactly where Jesus came from and would have grown up. Nazareth was in the shadow of a very important place that is never mentioned in the Gospels. Let me get to Herod in a second. I think I'm a little bit ahead of myself. Nazareth was a very important place. Nazareth was not an important place. It was in the shadow of a very important place called Sepphoris. Now, Sepphoris is not mentioned in the New Testament, but it's right over the hill from Nazareth. It's probably an hour walk from where Jesus was born. And Sepphoris was the major economic hub of the whole region. And like many major economic hubs, they would have pulled in day laborers from various villages around it. And almost certainly, Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, would have commuted each day, or maybe he lived in Sepphoris, and would have worked on building projects. You probably have heard that Joseph was a carpenter. The word in Greek, teknon, just means skilled worker, and most certainly he wasn't a woodworker. That's what I think of when he was a carpenter. He was a stonemason, and he worked to build these major structures at Sepphoris, all at almost slave labor cost. So he was an itinerant worker, employed at low cost, and there were thousands of Josephs in this region working at places like Sepphoris. Worse still, politically, there was a leader and controlled named Herod the Great. You probably have heard of Herod before, right? Now, the confusing thing about Herod in the New Testament is that there's at least 4 guys named Herod, because ancient Herod was a lot like George Foreman. You remember George Foreman, the boxer? He named all of his kids George, which I don't really know why you do that, but Herod did that. So there's Herod the Great. He's the Herod when Jesus was born. And then you have Herod Antipas, who is the Herod when Jesus is an adult. There's a couple other Herods too. We won't get into them. They're all related to this first Herod. Anyway, Herod the Great was sort of the ruler of this whole region, and Rome would have installed him to control this area. Now, Herod the Great had some power, but the way Herod got even more power is that he had building projects. He built things, really spectacular cities, and guess who Herod named those places after? Well, sometimes himself.
Caesarea?
Yeah, he named them after Caesar, right? So he made these extraordinary cities at great cost. He named them after Caesar. That made Caesar happy. So what did that give Herod? More power, right? Let me show you some of these places that he made. This is Caesarea from Caesar Maritima. This is right along the coast. You can go and see these ruins today. This, by the way, is where Pontius Pilate was located. and where he would have traveled from during Passover when he came to sit in judgment over Jesus. A major hub. And this was Caesar's incredible palace. Where is it? The palace is here, that Herod built for Caesar. Another place, another big building project for Herod was the temple. Herod rebuilt the temple. And spoiler alert, it wasn't because he liked the Jews. The temple rehabilitation building project was just another way of showing off in honor of Caesar. Now the question is, where did the money come for all of these projects? Well, it came from taxes, right? There was a 12.5 annual tax levied on all people in the Galilee that went to Caesar. Now 12.5 might not seem that bad to you, right? In fact, if we all had 12.5 tax rates, that would probably be an advantage for most of us. But remember, already, if you are a farmer in the Galilee, your margins were razor thin, right? So 12.5 off for a subsistence farmer might well push you into poverty. And this is the tax that went directly to Caesar. But friends, that wasn't it. Because Herod also installed a tax of it for his own, right? So 12.5 went to Caesar. About a 33% tax, income tax, went to Herod himself. And in order to collect that tax, Herod needed a whole army of tax collectors. Now, we end up hearing a lot about tax collectors in the Gospels, don't we? They're always called sinners. Why is that? Why were tax collectors always called sinners in the Gospels? Let's start here, and then we'll move elsewhere.
I'm going to bet that they were pretty violent in collecting taxes.
Yes. How did you get these taxes? There weren't like W-2s and things like that you submitted. Like people came to your house to get the money. And you were already suspicious of the tax collectors because they're tied up in this system of extraction that was going to these, that was impoverishing a very poor region. So that's part of it. They might have been ruthless in their extraction of taxes. But why else might the tax collectors have been considered sinners? There's another reason. Just be as cynical as possible. Like really think the worst of these people for a second.
Okay. They took a little bit off the top for themselves?
They took a little bit off the top, and maybe even a more than a little bit. So let's imagine that Herod Antipas is owed 33%. David will not do this. He's a pious, righteous individual. But someone else less pious and righteous might take 40%. That 7% stays for David. The other 33 goes along. So do you see what's happening? There is probably no less than 50% of the annual tax rate or annual income goes from the people to either Herod or Caesar. 50% of what were probably 1 or 2% margins. So basically, by definition, if you were in Galilee, and remember Jesus' family is in Galilee, and all of the people he talks to are in Galilee until the last week of his life, almost by definition, because of this systemic setup, we're poor. And not just a little poor. These were deeply impoverished people. Friends, that is the context of Jesus' ministry.
Was Matthew a tax collector? Was one of the disciples?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is a thought that Matthew was a tax collector. I don't know a ton about that and what that would have meant for him and sort of how he became converted out of that. But that's a great question. Why am I having a hard time saying that? Let me just pause at this moment. Do you sort of feel it? Do you see a little bit of what's happening in here? Massive building projects. Some cities are becoming incredibly wealthy due to a system of tributes and taxes, whereas other places are becoming incredibly impoverished. This is a massive wealth gap that was emerging at the time of Jesus.
This might be naive, but it was like a redistribution of wealth.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly the way to say it. And remember, in the Old Testament, remember when we did Econ 101, Ancient Israel style? One of the things that we noticed is that in a subsistence farming system, one of the goals, idealistically, was to ensure that everyone had enough. And that ideally in the ancient world, there wasn't a wealth gap. There wasn't this radical redistribution of wealth. But this system here, set up by Rome and Herod, radically disrupts that and actually guarantees that there's going to be a massive distribution or inequality of wealth. You know, sometimes today we talk about the 1% and the 99%. I think that was true in the ancient world but I want to make a change on the math. It was probably the 99.9% and the 0.1%. I think the gaps were even bigger, the margins even greater, the distribution even more skewed from the masses to the very few minority rich. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Questions? I know this is just setup, but this setup is important. Remember, when you do your homework and you go home and read all the Gospel of Matthew this afternoon, this is what I want in your forefront of your imagination. Please.
I'm remembering the Pharisees, I think it was, talking to Jesus and being like, is it unlawful to not pay your taxes to the Caesar?
Sure.
And I found that interesting because it very much felt like I'm not trying to get arrested yet. So give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. Seems very much I don't want to get arrested yet, but I still have something to say.
Yeah, that's a good way of reading that text. I think there's a lot to that. I think it's a confusing and complex text where Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Another way, and this is not in contradiction to what you're saying, is that Jesus is saying, sure, pay this tax, but let's talk about the taxation system. That is, the solution isn't withholding your tax now. The solution is rethinking the entire economic model that gives Herod control. So that would be another way to think about this. Hey, let me pull this together. Then I want to look at some texts. This, by the way, is just there's a story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. You might remember him. He's the guy who climbs the tree. Do you remember that? The wee little man, which I always take some offense of. He was, I'm a wee little man in a certain way. I see it as a virtue of Zacchaeus. But this was an amazing story where he actually is so convicted by his encounter with Jesus that he gives half his possessions away. And he says, if I have defrauded anyone of anything, spoiler alert, he did. There's no if. I did defraud people. I will pay back 4 times as much. This is someone who really participates not just in charity, but in justice. He is saying, it's not enough for me then to just go be nice to poor people. I have to radically divest from a system of exploitation, right? So it's a sort of a beautiful story. Again, in the 92 week of the course, we would talk more about that. But let me pull some of this together by saying this. With this context in mind, we hear in a new way Jesus' words in Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all that you are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. This is one of those texts that we ought not to over-spiritualize, right? Of course, we all have spiritual burdens, and we're all spiritually weary. That is true. But this is a text that actually was a statement about the economic reality, the poverty of the people in this region. People came to Jesus in their impoverishment, not just with the hopes of being forgiven their sins, but with the hopes that this person would initiate a revolution that would radically change the economic world in which they live. They knew that the good news of Jesus wasn't just eternal life in heaven with God. It was the hope for this world being radically restored and renewed in light of God's economy, not Caesar's. So that's something different to think of. Now, Jesus' concern for the poor becomes evident in so many different passages. And here we're going to focus in mostly on Matthew. Next week, we're going to look at Luke, where there are even more texts that come to it. So I'm a few clicks behind here. Oh, one last thing. There's just so much to say. There's this interesting encounter early on. Do you remember John the Baptist? He gets imprisoned for a couple different reasons. He's basically says some things politically that he ought not to say. Anyway, he's in prison, and John is wondering, he's heard of Jesus, and he's wondering, is this really the guy? Is this really the Messiah? Is this really the one who we are to expect? And Jesus says to his disciples, go and tell John what you hear and see. He's basically going to say, here's the evidence that I'm legit. Now, Jesus could have said anything. He could have said, go and tell John the Baptist that I'm omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. He could have spoken in these wide and lofty and abstract theological ways about his divinity. But notice what Jesus says to tell John the Baptist as evidence that he is the true Messiah. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. What does all this have in common that Jesus says? Or what's your reaction to this? Their actions. Okay, so it's not theological doctrines that have to be agreed upon, right? It's very action-oriented. What else do you hear in this? It's people-oriented, absolutely. And what type of people is it oriented to? The disenfranchised, the suffering, the sick, the marginalized. I mean, we could have a bunch of different terms, but this is the least, the last, and the lost, isn't it? Right?
This is not a prophecy. This is all real time. It's happening every day.
Right. This is action, it's people-focused, and it's now. This is not in the sweet by and by, once you die and live with Jesus in heaven. This is the now stuff. I'm not dismissing that sweet by and by heaven stuff. Please hear me. But this is now stuff. And this is what Jesus chooses to highlight. He says, being my ministry and being a follower of me means that we are deeply engaged in this type of work. And that's what convinced John. Because you see, the thing about John the Baptist is he read his Old Testament. He did his homework. He did read the whole Old Testament after week 1, and he got it. He knew what the Old Testament had to say. He wasn't surprised about how much of the Old Testament talked about economics and poverty. He knew that. And so when he hears Jesus saying this, he's like, this is it. This is the culmination of all that I've been reading about in these ancient texts. Are you with me? Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's keep going. There's so much to get in here. I want to start with Matthew 6. As Matthew 6, if you can't do all of the homework of reading all of Matthew this afternoon, just read Matthew 6. It's a chapter that is just packed with economic stuff. And we're just going to survey a few of it and just sort of listen in now with this new perspective in mind on what Jesus is saying. He begins. So whenever you give alms, so he's assuming giving alms, by the way, is charity. It's that individual act of kindness. So notice that he's assuming that people do it, right? It's not either or, justice or charity. It's both. So when you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Right? You probably have heard this text before. How do we, what are ways, I want to sort of jump to a modern context. How do we violate this? In what ways do we in the church or we in our lives do charity in a way that brings focus on us rather than those we serve?
Well, one way is with the feeding ministry.
Okay, how?
They take a meal to this group of indigent people, and it's all talked about as Church of the Epiphany.
Okay.
So the Church of the Epiphany is becoming the major thing, rather than the alms that they're giving to the men.
So it's not bad that they're doing that, right? It would be really clear. But it's, where's the spotlight? Where is the story?
It's on the church.
Right? It can be, right?
When you give something, that it's asked if that you want to be anonymous or
Yeah.
your name published.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I worked with a church one time, and again, these are not about bad intentions, friends. Please, please, please hear me. These efforts at charity are often full of faith and full of love and compassion. But I worked with one church, and it was just so focused on, I mean, it was not anonymous. The point was that it was blank, blank church that was doing this. And when they were talked about impact of their ministry, they only were measuring what they did. Right? So we had X number of volunteers who gave X number of hours on X number of Sundays in a row, and X pound of bacon, and X dozen eggs. And that's all fine in a certain way, but it's measuring their own activity and not the impact of it. Let's go back here, a few hands. Let's go in a row here.
Another example, which is outside of my salary level, is naming rights. I mean, you see hospitals that are named after the major donor for the hospital, or libraries and things like that, which are good things, but it's emblazoned with whoever the major donor was.
Yeah, that can be a part of it. And friends, again, all this is not black and white. I'm not saying there aren't reasons to, name a school after someone, or all of this is complex. We're asking to raise this question: where is our focus? Where is our attention?
Wearing the T-shirt that comes with having
Yeah. I love a good T-shirt for a service project, but maybe that participates in it. Yeah.
I was just going to say there is a sense in, if you go too far in this direction, that you almost get to kind of a shaming for this behavior. I think what I wonder is if it becomes too much or primarily about ego, that is your ego, then you've kind of lost the point, right?
Yeah. And there's a possibility with that, Paul, of a certain paternalism in this, that like we have the stuff that you need and we deem it okay to come to you and give these resources. Again, I'm not saying that that's people's intentions or heart behind that. In fact, I'm quite sure that in most cases that's not the intention or the attitude. But it can feel that way, right? It can be we the haves are giving to you the have-nots, and often there are racial dynamics wrapped up in that, right? There are many things sort of coming in to play. So this is a challenge not about our good hearts, but about sort of the effects, maybe the unintended consequences of how we approach charity. This continues, because later in Matthew 6, we have the Lord's Prayer, a prayer that we pray, I believe, every week in service, and maybe for some of you very pious friends out there, maybe you pray it outside of church and as part of your own life of faith. Listen to this prayer again now with economics on your mind and think about, where do you hear economics? Pray then in this way: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us into the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. Do you hear any economics in here? It probably jumps off a little bit more, doesn't it? Yeah, please.
I find it interesting just thinking about this. You've mentioned taxation.
Yes. Yep.
You've mentioned charity. And there's a real struggle in our economy now over the value of philanthropy versus the value of taxation, and which is the more effective. In other words, somebody just mentioned about the name on the hospital, but philanthropy has a purpose, especially among wealth. And then the abuse of taxation has a purpose among wealth.
Absolutely.
And so part of that economy you're describing in Jesus' time definitely plays those two things against each other.
Yeah. What that brings to mind was one time in a lecture with the head of the organization's name, I'm just forgetting right now, but it was one of the biggest sort of charitable institutions in giving away food for the hungry. And he was talking about how much money they raise, how much they give away, and he said all that they do, and there were staggering numbers that they had raised. They said this is 1/10, or no, it was even worse. It was like 1/50th of what could be done if they changed one policy in the U.S. government related to food. And so he was saying, like, look at this huge organization. It's doing so much, and it's a drop in the bucket in comparison to what happens if we change the system, right? So that's part of it there. Please.
So could you say that since that could be a given, that a large organization would do this, to look good, but all the people that make that work, that do the leg lifting and all of that, they're trying to use whatever power
That's right.
they have to make it better for everyone else. So it's a reaction from the everyday person to try to fit themselves into that.
Yeah, you're totally right. And that's where this is always a both and. So he wasn't saying, stop supporting our organization that's doing this vital work. He was just saying, we need to do both things. We need to be active in this sphere, and there need to be organizations like ours that are stepping up and responding immediately. Yeah, let's get one more in the back.
I think you asked a question. Seems like give us this day our daily bread. Economic.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know what's interesting about that word is when I used to hear that word, I just thought it meant, like, daily means like day by day, like give me my bread for Sunday and then Monday and then Tuesday, and right, that's how it's normally used. But in the Greek, they don't use the word that means give us our Sunday, then Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday bread. The word that's translated as daily means something more like this is going to be a little bit of a paraphrase, my only enough for today bread. My only enough for today bread. It's a prayer of sufficiency. It's a prayer that says, God, only give me enough, not more than enough, because Jesus knows that it's in a community where people have only enough that everyone has enough. When people have way more than enough, that means something for the other people in the community. That often produces other people not having it enough. So it's a prayer of sufficiency, give me just enough, rather than a prayer of continuance, which is how we typically read it. Paul, did you want to jump in on that?
I'm also fascinated with this, give us this day our daily bread. And
Yeah.
it seems like that's kind of a counter to the hoarding and the food hoarding and the food cities and all of that the Pharaoh and sort of for the people who are being spoken to here, it's kind of like, there's a tendency to, oh, well, they did it, we should do this too. And so Jesus is saying, no. And forgive us our debts. It seems like if you are satisfied with your daily bread, maybe you might not have debts.
And I should say, if you're satisfied with your daily bread, you'd be all the more willing to forgive the debt of others, because you don't now need to extract from them extra surplus to build your storehouses, right? It all comes together. I also just have, verse 11 is sort of my mental throwaway line, because I actually have never, because of my privilege, I've never been in a spot where I've wondered if I would have food for today. But now imagine someone experiencing extreme poverty praying this prayer. This isn't like an abstract, metaphorical, give us this day our daily bread. Imagine someone praying this and wondering if or how they would get their food for the day, right? That's a really different prayer than what I pray, usually. Let's go back here, please.
Well, I was going to say, like, the text a couple of slides ago that talks about, like, do it in secret, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. I struggle with that in the idea of creating a society that's like you're talking about, where everybody has enough for today.
Yeah.
Because it seems to rely on that kind of structural change or like real sort of justice-oriented social organization requires us to model behavior for each other as a community in a really visible way. And I think about that a lot as a parent, that like I talk to my daughter about how we're showing up in communities that have been established of mutual aid, and those sort of rely on social media and different things where we sort of know, like, here's what the need is, here's how we're responding. And I learned to do that in my community in Atlanta because I saw other people doing it. And I was like, oh, that's what we're doing.
Cool.
Okay, I'll do that. So I needed it to be visible. But I really like the kind of juxtaposition of the give us today our daily bread. And then it goes right next to forgive our debts so that we are forgiven. So maybe it's not sort of saying like, do it in secret, tell no one, but it's saying don't keep a ledger. Don't keep track, right?
That.
So like, it's not about like we have to hide from participating in this community of collective abundance by giving freely, but what you're not gonna do is like write it down. I did this much, so therefore I get to have this much later on when I need it. It's just when you have it, you give it. When you need it, you receive it.
Oh, so beautifully put. I love that, because I think you're right. It's not about being invisible necessarily, because we need visible models, right? We need to shine a light. But the ledger thing, I'd never thought of it that way. That's brilliant. I think that's a beautiful connecting point to it. Yeah, really, really good. Let's go one more here, then I'm going to make a further connection later in Matthew 6.
Well, from when the Israelites were fleeing from Egypt, in the desert, they received manna,
Yes.
their daily bread.
Yeah.
Those that tried to stockpile it and hoard it, their manna rotted away to
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah.
I was gonna make a joke about universal basic income earlier, but
Yeah.
that's actually what this is.
Well, sure, and it's a great connection back to the Old Testament. It's Exodus 16. The people are just out of Egypt. They don't have enough food. God provides manna and quail, but there's a catch. God says, only gather as much as you need according to the number of your family. So it's not equal as in everyone gets X amount. It's everyone gets a proportional amount based on the size of your family. And it's daily bread. And what do people do? They gather more than they need, right? And it rots away. And then they're also not supposed to gather on Sabbath. They're supposed to rest on Sabbath. So there's a double portion given on the day before. What do they do on the Sabbath? They go out and gather more. It's like remember Hungry Hungry Hippos when you were maybe little? Like you're just always grabbing for more. And this is sufficiency. Grabbing for more all the time, whose behavior is that? It's Pharaoh's, right? Yeah, Peter.
Every military mess hall I've ever been in, there's a sign that says, take all you want, but eat all you take. And really, it's don't waste food.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, don't take, therefore, more than you need.
And be thinking, because if you take more than you need, again, the idea is who's not getting enough if you get more than enough. Just right after, anticipating all of your comments and connections, Jesus says this, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, right? This is right after the prayer, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Like this is sort of pulling together these threads from the Lord's Prayer and saying, basically if I had to translate this, it would be don't be Pharaoh. Because remember what Pharaoh is doing. He's enslaving the Israelites to build storehouses. Storehouses for what? For the abundance he's extracted from all of the people who are enslaved, not just the Israelites, right? Friends, it is remarkably, astonishingly, almost hard to believe, 12:15. And the good news is, I got us through one chapter. The bad news is, there are more than one chapter in the Gospel of Matthew. So there are more things to look at. The final good news is that we have another week. So we're going to just keep pulling these threads. We're going to keep looking at text. And what I think the exciting thing and the powerful thing that I hope is happening is that these are not new texts to you. These are texts you've heard and seen and read, but you're now seeing them with a new set of lenses. And I hope that process of looking again for the first time at these familiar texts is opening up possibilities, is opening up questions that might lead you in this community to think differently about your call to be disciples who care deeply about economics and poverty as part of your gospel ministry in this world. So we'll continue, same bat place, same bat time next week. Thank you, everyone. Stay warm and have a good week.